Welcome into the show today. This is a Minnesota Vikings podcast by Minnesota Tim, which is 100% honest 100% of the time, regardless of how you feel about a situation. Hit that subscribe button if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or Google or Amazon, wherever it is, iHeart, hit that follow button wherever you are listening so this podcast shows up in your feed Monday through Saturday, 6 times a week. All right, before I talk about the Minnesota Vikings, there was a big story recently that involved another plane crash. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of plane crashes recently. Of course, you had the one in Washington, D.C., Ronald Reagan. You've had near Ronald Reagan International Airport, which I've flown into countless times. I've lived in Washington, D.C., and this actually brings me back to a memory on a plane when I was about to land at Reagan, which, knowing what we know now, who knows how true it is, but it was a scary situation. We're descending to land at Ronald Reagan. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the plane changes course of action. We're descending. And all of a sudden it goes straight up into the air and almost like it was trying to avoid something. Now, who knows what it was trying to avoid? Obviously, we avoided it, but it was not a natural descent onto the ground to Ronald Reagan International Airport. It is one of the busiest airports in the world. You stand down there, you watch the planes come in, and there's a plane coming in like every 3 to 4 minutes. They have a cool watching viewing area right by Ronald Reagan International Airport where the planes literally fly straight over your head. It almost feels like you could touch it. Obviously, you can. And you stand there, and there are planes coming in over and over and over again. So, Dulles Airport, I've never even touched my foot near that airport because the convenience of Ronald Reagan is so close. But anyways, the point that I was trying to get to is that there was another Delta crash. A Minneapolis plane going to Toronto, Canada, landed awkwardly, put too much pressure or force on that front wheel. The plane flipped, and thankfully, miraculously, nobody was seriously injured on that plane. There's a couple of people that had to go to the hospital and get checked out and maybe even have an overnight stay, but nobody had a life-threatening injury after that crash. And a few days after, the Delta Airlines decided to make a decision for every passenger on board. And the decision is this. Delta Airlines is now offering a $30,000 payoff to victims of their plane crash just 2 days after it occurred. And someone posted this question. Are they trying to pay people off to get ahead of the impending DEI pilot revelations? Delta and operator Endeavor, famous for their all-female crews, have still refused to identify the pilots who crashed the plane. And I think we all know why. That came from Nick Sortor on X. And seeing this story play out and following it closely, because this was a plane from Minneapolis landing in Toronto, I can't help but ask myself a hypothetical question. Would you be a part of a plane crash, know you would survive, 100% chance of survival, and then you would be guaranteed $30,000 afterwards? If you knew the fact that you would survive this plane crash and were going to be given $30,000 because of the accident, then would you accept that? Now, I'm afraid of heights, and think about the mental toll that this would take. Maybe that's too much to overcome when you think about getting a free $30,000. I'm afraid of heights. I don't ever want to go on the Power Tower at Valley Fair. But if you offered me $30,000 to go on the Power Tower at Valley Fair, sign me up and I'd go on it 10 times in a row. But this is different. This is a plane literally crashing. But if you knew the outcome of this situation before the situation happened, obviously, if it was a 50-50 outcome or even a 75-25 outcome, even if it was a 95% outcome, survival to death threat, I would not participate in this. But if you knew you had a 100% chance of survival and you would walk out unscathed and you'd be just fine, would you do it? Would you do it? $30,000. It's a lot of money. But this is a Minnesota Vikings podcast, and I talk about the Minnesota Vikings. That's why it's a Minnesota Vikings podcast. Former Vikings punter. This is not my A topic, but I'm going to get there in a second. Former Vikings punter, Chris Kluwe. Remember that guy? Chris Kluwe was arrested while protesting the MAGA movement in front of a city council meeting about President Trump. He called it a Nazi movement and said he would also engage in civil disobedience. The police handcuffed him and carried him out. Now, I don't get too political. I'm definitely not a left-winger. And if you had to ask me if I'm more of a left-winger or a right-winger, I'm definitely more of a right-winger because of what that party stands for. But I think both sides of the party are messed up. I voted in the 2024 election, but I did not vote in the 2020 election because I chose that the President of the United States doesn't dictate how good of a life that I can create for myself. I believe that hard work and dedication and thinking smartly determines what happens. And of course, by the faithfulness of the Lord Jesus Christ, that will determine a lot about what happens to you and where you end up in life. But taking a look at Chris Kluwe's comments, just a few months ago, people called Trump Hitler, and then he was almost assassinated in Pennsylvania. And then everyone came, well, we just need to band together and come together and unite and have civil conversation and talk and let's stop with the name calling. And that stopped for about a day. And then about 2 weeks later, people were back calling Trump Hitler. Oh, Trump's Hitler. Oh, his plan is Hitler-esque. What would you call Joe Biden and his plan letting in thousands, if not thousands and thousands more of illegal immigrants coming across the southern border? What if Trump is a Nazi for his plan, then what is Joe Biden? What is his plan? It's so funny how, if you're a right-winger, you hate everything the left-winger does. And if you're a left-winger, like Chris Kluwe obviously is, then you hate everything Donald Trump does. I've always posed this question to people that are right-wingers about left-wingers and to left-wingers about right-wingers. If a left-winger, Chris Kluwe, who is probably not strong like Cash, or maybe he is. I can't remember how long his career was. But if you are a left-winger and Donald Trump walked into your house right now and offered you $500,000 just because you were a good American citizen, would you still despise Donald Trump? Would you still hate him? Same thing to a right-winger. If Joe Biden walked into your office and offered you $600,000 because he wanted to one-up Trump, would you still despise Joe Biden? Would you still stand up against the decisions or the policies that he implemented? And just a random question. I don't mean to get too political. But time to get into the A topic after 10 minutes of rambling about whatever nonsense I just rambled about. This is my podcast. I can do whatever the heck I want. Thank you for staying with me. The NFL salary cap and the Minnesota Vikings have been given a big boost. Dan Graziano of ESPN. The NFL today informed teams that the 2025 per team salary cap will fall in the range of $277.5 million to $281.5 million. Way up from last year, $255.4 million. So we're looking at $22 to $26 million increase. Cap will have increased by more than $53 million over the last 2 years. And the way that affects the Vikings is that they already were entering the offseason with a plethora of cap space. And Ben Gethsling of Star Tribune said this in his X tweet. This would put the Vikings with between 61 million and 65 million of cap space before the 2025 league year. More adjustments could still be ahead, but they'll have more spending room than they've had in years. The Minnesota Vikings are going to spend big this upcoming free agency to put together the right resources around QB1 J.J. McCarthy. And the Minnesota Vikings just received a huge benefit to their offseason plan. And this one came from Pro Football Talk on X. He was one of the reporters. Chiefs are not expected to franchise or transition tag Trey Smith, which means he'll be an unrestricted free agent that the Minnesota Vikings could target this offseason. And you put him, I don't know if he's a left tackle or right guard or left guard, but you put him next to Christian Darrisaw or Brian O'Neill, and he immediately improves the Vikings' offensive line. So the cap goes up. The Chiefs aren't transitioning or tagging offensive lineman Trey Smith, which means the Minnesota Vikings can target him and one other guy via free agency and use the draft picks to select a running back and defensive pieces in the secondary and defensive tackles. So this is all good news for the Vikings. Now, the cap goes up for everybody. The cap doesn't just go up for the Vikings. The cap goes up for every other team in the NFL. But as it appears, the Minnesota Vikings are going to be a very big spender this offseason because they have the sixth most money to spend in the entire league. And this goes back 3 years ago when Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah got hired and Kevin O'Connell. This has been a part of their plan from the start. And it's the reason why they weren't offering Kirk Cousins a lucrative multi-year deal. They were very restrictive on the amount of money that they were going to offer Cousins because they wanted a rookie contract as a quarterback and be able to spend their money elsewhere to try to build a Super Bowl roster. Kirk Cousins, his greatness didn't quite, overcome the amount of money you're going to spend on the guy. Same thing with Sam Darnold. Darnold is not so great that you're going to spend $50 million a year on him because he can't overcome other positions on the football field like a Patrick Mahomes. And the Vikings certainly can't overcome their ability right now to draft guys on rookie contracts and put them in position to succeed at a very cheap rate. So the Vikings plan this offseason, whether it's to tag and trade Darnold or let Darnold walk completely, that kind of seems like the vibe Kevin O'Connell's been sending for the last few weeks in his comments. The Vikings have money. and they want the money. And they're going to show me the money because they need to put together strong pieces around their first-time starting quarterback, J.J. McCarthy. And things are looking good and things are looking bright for the Vikings because of the cap going up, which means they can offer more money for a Trey Smith. And the Chiefs are planning to let 25-year-old guard Trey Smith to free agency. And according to PFF, Pro Football Focus, taking a look at his grades, he was 14th out of 135 guards last season. He had a 78.8 overall grade. In his pass block, he was 33rd out of 135. And his run blocking, he is 10th out of 135. This would be a good addition for the Vikings offensive line. And he's only 25 years old. It's not a situation where, maybe he's got 2 years left on his, to play. And maybe the Vikings can ooze out any talent that he has left in his career. He's 25 years old. If the Vikings sign him to a multi-year deal, he will be entering his prime in a matter of moments, in a matter of a year or two. So this definitely has to be a guy the Vikings are going to target this offseason in free agency, and things are looking good because the cap went up. Vikings get more money to spend. Other teams did too. But the Vikings already had money to spend, and now they can spend even more. So it's just going to strengthen the roster, which is a very, very good thing. Thank you for watching this episode. Thank you for sticking with me and my rambling and my hypothetical questions and my analysis on all things sports, politics, and plane rides. Appreciate you all. Thank you for making this podcast part of your day, and hit that subscribe and follow button wherever you are watching or listening.